Thistle Yolette Harris, born 29 July 1902 and died 5 July 1990, also known as Thistle Stead, was an Australian botanist, educator, author and conservationist. Biography. She was one of three daughters born to Charles Thomas Harris and Ilma Richardson Harris, née Rokes. She was educated at Redlands School SEECGS Redlands, Cremorne, where she was taught by the English teacher, Constance Le Plastrier, 1864–1938, who was a member of the Naturalists' Society of New South Wales and co-author of Botany for Australian Students, 1916, and helped foster Harris's interest in native plants. Harris died in 1990 at a nursing home in Summerhill, New South Wales. Education. Harris studied botany at the University of Sydney, graduating with a degree in botany in 1924 followed by a Diploma of Education in 1925 from Sydney Teachers College. After several years as a science teacher in secondary schools, she became a lecturer in science education at Sydney Teachers College, 1938–61. In 1945 she was awarded a Master of Education degree from the University of Melbourne and studied for a diploma in landscape design at the University of New South Wales between 1968 and 1969. Harris later featured her efforts to revegetate the mine workings at the central mine of the Sulphide Corporation in her book Australian Plants for the Garden, 1953. Harris also lectured on biological science at University of Sydney and on botany at Sydney Technical College. According to John Walter, her interest in Australian plants was also developed when she met Albert Morris, 1886–1939, while she taught at the school in Broken Hill between 1929 and 1930. Marriage. In 1951 she married pioneer conservationist and marine biologist David Stead, to whom she had been introduced by Le Plastrier in 1918 when she was 16. By marrying Stead she became the second stepmother to the Australian novelist and short story writer Christina Stead. Stead was 25 years older than Harris and died 6 years after their marriage. Work. Harris was a member of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects and she served as president and honorary secretary of the Wildlife Preservation Society of Australia. She was instrumental in facilitating the publication of the Society's journal Australian Wildlife, which was issued intermittently from 1934. She authored 12 books on Australian flora and their cultivation in suburban gardens. Harris's first book, Wildflowers of Australia, 1938, provided a popular flora of Australia and included studies of approximately 250 plants. Her book, Gardening with Australian Plants, Shrubs, 1977, describes over 100 genera covering 600 species. In 1963 Harris established the 50 hectares Wirrambirra Sanctuary at Bargo, New South Wales, in memory of her late husband, who had died in 1957. She also established the David G. Stead Memorial Wildlife Research Foundation of Australia to undertake its management. In 1965 she donated the property to the National Trust of Australia, NSW, and it is managed by the Foundation, with financial assistance from the Gould League of New South Wales. A building was erected on the property in 1971 to act as a field studies centre, and in 1973, a teacher from the education department was appointed to be a full-time education officer. Harris devoted herself to many causes, especially focused in conservation. In 1963 she was awarded the Field Naturalists Club of Victoria's Australian Natural History Medallion. In 1985 she was awarded an honorary doctorate of science by the University of Wollongong. Publications. Books authored by Harris include 1939 Wildflowers of Australia, illustrated by Adam Forster, Angus and Robertson, Sydney, with several later editions. 1945 Nature Problems, a book of nature study for young Australians. Brooks & Co., Sydney. 1953 Australian Plants for the Garden, a handbook on the cultivation of Australian trees, shrubs, other flowering plants, and ferns. Angus and Robertson, Sydney. 1956 Naturcraft in Australia, a guide for the nature lover, the bushwalker, the student, and the teacher. Angus and Robertson, Sydney. 1962 Eastern Australian Wildflowers. Angus and Robertson Limited. 1966 Around Australia Program, Australian Plant Life. Nelson Doubleday. 1970 Alpine Plants of Australia including subalpine and montane plants. Angus and Robertson, Sydney. ISBN 0-207-12071-4. 1976 The Ellis Stones Garden Book. Australian Landscape Gardening. Nelson, Melbourne. With Ellis Stones. 1977 Gardening with Australian Plants. Shrubs. Nelson, Melbourne. ISBN 0-17-005119-6. 1979 Gardening with Australian Plants. Small Plants and Climbers. Nelson, Melbourne. ISBN 0-17-005120-X. 1980 Gardening with Australian Plants. Trees. Nelson, Melbourne. ISBN 0-17-005121-8. Notes. Sources. Walter, J. 2009. Thistle Harris reflects on a trip to Melbourne. 1964. Australian Garden History 21. 1. 18-23. Webb, J. 2002. Harris. Thistle Yolette, p. 290 in. R. Aitken and M. Looker, eds. Oxford Companion to Australian Gardens. South Melbourne. Oxford University Press. Further reading. Webb, Joan. 1998. Thistle Y. Harris. A Biography of Thistle Yolette Stead. Surrey Beattie and Sons. Sydney. ISBN 0-949324-85-X. Wirrambirra Flora and Fauna Sanctuary.